Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are several developments in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to continue their offensive operations across the Serebets River line north of Liman, where they've managed to gain control over several fortified positions of the Ukrainian armed forces along one of the main supply roads between Borova and Liman. The Russians also managed to advance west of Belgorod in the Donetsk region, outside of the Luhansk region, going beyond the border area between the two regions, and in the direction of the Ukraine defensive lines along the Siversk section of the front line. The Russians also managed to advance along the Severodonetsk Canal, south of Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. The Russians also managed to advance in the western outskirts of the city of Toretsk, capturing one of the fortified positions on the outskirts of the city and moving beyond it to disconnect the towns west of Tretk from the supply lines there. The Russians also managed to make several advances in the Belgorod, Kursk, and Sumy regions in the northern section of the front line, where they managed to kick the Ukrainians out of two settlements in the Belgorod region and to improve their positions both in the outskirts of the Kursk region, where they almost have full control over the entire region, as well as in the Sumy region, where they advance in the direction of Luknia along the Luknia river line. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, we see that the Russians have managed to advance south of Pasivka in the direction of Luknia, gain control over some forest lines along the river line. They've also managed to advance in the eastern direction, threatening the Ukrainian positions along the main highway southwest of the border crossing between the Kursk and Sumy regions. The Russians are here developing offensive operations into the Sumy region, with the target being Unakivka. The Russians are advancing in the southern direction directly head-on along the Luknia river line. They're improving the positions along the main highway to advance from the eastern flank, and there's also some fighting along the western flank, both from Shiravka towards Bilovody, from Vasilivka towards Bilovody, and along this western road towards the city itself to cut off the main highway further back. The Russians are here looking to create some sort of buffer zone within the Sumy region beyond that of the Kursk region. The Russians also advanced west of Guevo, gaining control over the western outskirts of the town, as well as several forest patches and forest lines, where they're advancing towards the outskirts of the Kursk region. The Ukrainians only have Oleshnia and Gornel remaining under their hands in the Kursk region, where the remaining parts are under Russian control. In the Belgorod region, the Russians have managed to kick the Ukrainians out of both Popovka and Demidovka. They've also managed to improve their positions west of Grafovka, completely securing the town from the Ukrainian offensive operations. The Ukrainians only have a few positions here near Demidovka and Popovka remaining under their control, mostly in these forest lines and forest patches, which means that they barely have a bridgehead across the border area any longer. At the same time, the Ukrainians also hold on to Lipsy in the south, but based on this, we see that their bridgehead across the border area, the Ukrainian presence within the Belgorod region, is extremely limited, and they only have control over a single town which doesn't have any buildings. The main push of the Ukrainian forces into the Belgorod region was in the direction of Demidovka and Popovka, where they contested the towns in their entirety, attempting to isolate them by cutting off the roads to the southeast of Demidovka and moving along the western road towards Popovka, attacking both of them separately while creating additional crossings and bridgeheads across, where they established their positions within the forest patches and forest lines. The Russians then started counterattacks, where heavy fighting took place over both of these towns over the past few weeks, and now, a month into the Ukrainian offensive, they have yet to establish a proper position across the border area, and this shows that the operation here, with number of forces and the success it has had so far, is at best a distraction for the Russian forces. There is no significant threat coming from this direction to the Russian forces. Based on the number of vehicles and infantry being used in this offensive, it seems that the Ukrainians were launching a desperate attempt to try and salvage the situation following the collapse of the Kursk front. However, they have not managed to achieve any major success in this direction. Instead, they took casualties for a bunch of forest lines. The most difficult part of such an operation is to break through the border area itself, because there are several layers of anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth that they have to go through, and the Russians have prepared fortifications, trenches, and bunkers that they were using to defend against the Ukrainian offensive. The fact that the Ukrainians were not able to take advantage of the breach of the defensive line shows that they did not have near the necessary force to make the most of such a breach, so they instead ended up creating for themselves a meat grinder for their forces, and the Belgorod region offensive can be considered a complete failure for the Ukrainian forces. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians continued offensive operations across the Serbets River line. They've managed to capture several fortified positions to the southeast and northeast of Nove, gaining control over the fortified position along the main road, cutting off physically the main road, supplying the Ukrainian forces between Borova in the northwest and Liman in the southwest. The Russians also managed to advance on the outskirts of Nove from the southeast and gain control over a fortified position further south of that. The Russians are here looking to cut off Nove from the surrounding towns and isolate it to gain control of it and have a proper position along the main road for further offensive operations across it to the south and to the north to improve their positions along the western bank of the Serbets River line. The Russians also managed to advance along the river line itself, where they're looking to connect their forces in the Makiyevka bridgehead across the Serbets River line with the ones near Ivanivka and to the south. This will create a much wider bridgehead across the Serbets River line, and if they connect it further north as well, they will have complete control over both banks of the river line for the majority of it, with just a small part to the south remaining under Ukrainian control, where the rest of it would be under Russian control from Selmehivka in the north and all the way down south to Zarishne. This shows that the Russians will be able to launch significantly larger offensive operations across the Serbets River line with such a wide and deep bridgehead across, which means that the Russians may start launching offensive operations in the direction of Borova, Lusove, and Liman in the coming weeks. West of Belorivka, the Russians have managed to gain control over several forest patch and forest lines, reaching the outskirts of some of these fortified positions near Hryurivka in the direction of Siversk and Serebrianka. The Russians are here looking to advance along these forest lines towards Serebrianka and Hryurivka, considering the fact that the Russians had previously entered both Hryurivka and Serebrianka, but have failed to gain any foothold within these towns due to the lack of defensible positions and positions to entrench themselves within. They have decided to move through the forest patches and forest lines, clearing them of Ukrainian soldiers and entrenching themselves within them to avoid taking heavy casualties to Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery. This means that the Russians are now moving through a much slower and more difficult path, but it will allow themselves to entrench in these positions, and now fighting is taking place over these more defensible positions, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the first lines and first patches near Serebrianka and Hryurivka to establish themselves in a position along the Severodonetsk river line and along the high ground for offensive operations into the defensive line of the Ukrainians east of Siversk from the northern flank. This, combined with operations that will likely take place from the southern flank as well, along the railway through Vyemka towards the southern flank of Siversk, and the fortified positions on the high ground to the southeast of Siversk to improve their positions and put the Ukrainian positions within Siversk in a pincer. Along the Severodonetsk canal, the Russians have managed to create an additional crossing where they've managed to gain control over some fortified positions along the canal. They're fighting over the fortified positions along the first square here west of the bridgehead, where they're looking to gain control over a wider bridgehead with the already prior crossing here to the south. They'll be able to improve their positions north of Toretsk for offensive operations in the forest lines and fields in the northern flank, to improve their positions for further offensive operations along the railways towards Dashne and Delivka here in the northern flank of Toretsk, and for further offensive operations along the main railway all the way to Kostiantynivka for a push through the southeast. Again, the railways are extremely important for the Russian offensive operations, as they are typically located on the high ground with forest lines on the eastern and western flank, covering both sides, allowing for secure offensive operations on a wide area, and we can see it is directly connected from the northern flank of Toretsk to Konstantinivka, so it is a given road for offensive operations towards Konstantinivka, but this also means it's heavily fortified and well mined by the Ukrainian forces, as they expect these approaches now following several years of fighting. The Russians also improved their positions in the western outskirts of Toretsk, gaining control over the fortified positions here and reaching the roads here on the western outskirts of the city. The Russian objective here is to cut off the railway and the main road connecting the Ukrainian forces here near Shcherbinivka and Novospassky with Konstantinivka itself. And we can see that it is not a wide area here. It is actually the weakest point of the Ukrainian positions in the area. If the Russians are able to gain fire control over the road, they will be able to cut off the main supply line for the Ukrainian forces, and with additional advances on the western flank, they'll be able to cut it off there as well, and operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces within Novospassky and Shcherbinivka, limiting the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians. Combined with control over the fortified positions, they'll be able to gain control over both towns with limited resistance and significantly improve their positions here near Tretk, gaining control over the western flank with the river lines and reservoirs. Securing the flank, they'll be able to advance further towards the reservoir south of Konstantinivka and then move onwards to cut off the supply lines for the Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions in between Toretsk and Pokrosk. Or they can redirect their forces to the northern flank along the main railway towards Konstantinivka, or do both at the same time. And this points towards this intersection here, the weak point of the Ukrainian forces being the main target of the Russian forces. We see this geolocated footage of a Russian push here northwest of Toretsk, and there's also a old picture from the winter where there was still snow, where the Russians reached the intersection here to the west of Toretsk, and we see that it has been a target by the Russian forces for a long while, and this may be why the Ukrainians launched their counterattack when they did, to prevent the Russians from cutting it off. Now that the Russians have defeated the Ukrainian counterattack and are regaining full momentum and almost regained full control over the city, it is only a matter of time before they manage to cut it off and regain control over the city itself, as well as operationally encircle a important section of the Ukrainian defense here to the southeast of Konstantinivka. The southwest of Pokrosk, although the battle over Shevchenko has ended with the Russians defeating the Ukrainian counterattack there as well, there is this article by Deep State Map about the fighting of Shevchenko over the past few months. According to Deep State Map, the Ukrainians and the Russians saw the importance of Shevchenko. This led to Ukrainian counterattacks to regain control of it following the Russian capture of it, where they even managed to reach the southern outskirts and western outskirts of the town, cutting off the Russian forces. However, the Russians defeated the Ukrainian columns one after another, regaining and retaining full control over the town. This is due to its close proximity to Pokrosk and its fairly large size. It is the largest town in the western flank of Pokrosk, and therefore the Russians have drone operators, they have communication lines, and they have a lot of logistical support for their forces in the western flank through Shevchenko as a main hub. And this is why the Ukrainians looked to regain control of it and the Russians looked to defend it at pretty much all costs. This led to heavy fighting, and according to Deep State Map, some of the best Ukrainian soldiers in this section of the front line to launch these operations. However, they were all defeated, and now the Russians retain full control over the town, and they've also managed to regain the initiative on the western and northern flanks of the western pincer maneuver of the Russian forces to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians west of Pokrovsk. And based on this, we can see that the Ukrainians had attempted several counterattacks in the eastern and southeastern section of the front line, but all of them have so far failed. They attempted the Belgorod crossing, it also failed. This is all despite the fact that the Russians have been launching offensive operations non-stop since October 2023. That is now a year and a half of constant offensive operations by the Russian forces. But they aren't exhausted. Instead, they were able to defend against Ukrainian new offensives that took place after gathering troops and reserves for over a year. And at the same time, The Russians have also been able to continue their own offensive operations in several sectors of the front line, improving their positions mostly in the southwest of the Donetsk region, but also in the Kupiansk direction, along the Serbets River line and Uska River line, and in the Liman direction. The Russians have made several advances. They've also entered into the Sumy region. Now the question raised is whether the Ukrainian counterattacks are sustainable as well, or if it is only the Russians who are able to sustain these sort of operations for a long time. If the Ukrainians are launching operations that are not sustainable, then the Russians will have a significant increase in their momentum and speed that they are capturing the Ukrainian positions across the front line. However, if the Ukrainians are able to sustain these sort of operations for a longer term, they'll be able to continue this back and forth with the Russians and slow down the Russian offensive operations as well. However, based on the fact that the Russians have fully regained the momentum here in April, having significantly more advances compared to the Ukrainians, and especially compared to prior months, it seems that the Russians have been able to regain the initiative, and the Ukrainian offensive operations that they launched since the mid of January were not sustainable. However, for a concrete and definite conclusion, we'll have to wait over the next few weeks to see whether the Ukrainians will continue their own offensive operations, launch these counterattacks, and to improve their defensive positions or not. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.